When Baron Trump offered his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one could have anticipated the remarkable revelation that would unfold mid-flight. What followed left the entire plane in stunned silence. The cabin lights flickered softly as passengers settled into their seats, the usual mix of pre-flight anticipation and mild commotion filling the air. It was a crisp morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was completely booked. Among the travelers was a young man seated in first class, his face instantly recognizable to many, though his reserved demeanor suggested he preferred to go unnoticed. Barron Trump, now a tall teenager, towering over 6 feet, sat quietly by the window, flipping through a hardcover book. Unlike other members of his family, he rarely made public appearances, but his name, printed on the boarding pass, inevitably drew attention. Meanwhile, in the economy section, an elderly man in his late 70s made his way to his seat. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back slightly bent, and his steps careful as he carried a well-worn leather duffel bag. His military jacket, adorned with faded patches and medals, spoke of a life of service and sacrifice. Passengers exchanged glances as he passed, some murmuring about his evident past, while others simply observed the quiet dignity in his movements. He eventually settled near the rear of the plane, seated between a talkative businessman and a restless toddler. As the flight attendants hurried down the aisles, ensuring passengers were ready for takeoff, a small commotion began in the back. The elderly veteran seemed visibly uncomfortable, quietly insisting on needing a different seat. He apologized for the disruption, but his distress was clear. The commotion caught Barron's attention. From his comfortable spot in first class, he leaned slightly into the aisle, his brows knitting in concern. After a brief moment of thought, he pressed the flight attendant call button. "Excuse me," he said softly when the attendant approached. "Could I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The request caught her off guard, her expression momentarily stunned. In first class, heads turned and murmurs spread. It wasn't every day someone volunteered to give up such a coveted seat, especially not someone of Barron's status. But his expression was calm, and his tone left no room for debate. "Let me check," the flight attendant replied, her voice tinged with surprise. She moved quickly toward the back of the plane. As Barron stood to grab his carry-on bag, the whispers in first class grew louder. A woman sitting nearby leaned toward him. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice filled with bewilderment. "You paid for this seat." Barron simply smiled and shrugged. "Some people deserve it more," he replied. What happened next shifted the mood of the entire flight. The flight attendant returned, her expression a blend of admiration and intrigue. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron, her voice trembling slightly. It wasn't often someone willingly gave up such luxury, especially a teenager whose name carried considerable weight. Barron nodded politely, collected his belongings, and walked down the aisle. Passengers watched intently, some whispering to each other, others discreetly snapping photos with their phones. Barron appeared unaffected by the attention, his focus fixed on the man seated in the back. When Barron reached the elderly veteran, the man looked up, puzzled. "Are you sure, young man?" he asked, his voice strong but marked by years of experience. "You don't have to do this for me." "I want to," Barron said firmly, extending a hand. "Thank you for your service. Please, Take my seat. The veteran hesitated briefly, seeming to weigh the offer, but the sincerity in Barron's eyes was impossible to dismiss. Slowly, the older man rose, gripping Barron's hand firmly. "Well, thank you. That's mighty kind of you," he said. As the veteran moved toward first class, murmurs of astonishment rippled through the cabin. A young mother in row 15 leaned over to her teenage daughter. "Did you see that? He gave up his seat," she whispered. Meanwhile, the businessman, who had been seated next to Barron, raised an eyebrow and muttered half to himself, "Never seen anything like that on a flight." Barron, now seated in the cramped economy section, adjusted his tall frame to fit the smaller space. He appeared entirely unbothered by the change, ignoring the curious glances of other passengers. A flight attendant stopped by, quietly offering assistance, but Barron simply shook his head and reopened his book. In first class, the veteran sank into the plush seat, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the armrest. The comfort and unexpected gesture of kindness seemed to overwhelm him. A flight attendant approached with a complimentary drink and a blanket, explaining, "The young man said you should have this seat." The veteran managed a faint smile. "It's been years since anyone treated me like this," he murmured. His gaze drifted toward the economy section, where Barron sat calmly, engrossed in his book. Though small in action, the gesture carried an immense impact. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the cabin as the tension of boarding gave way to calm. Passengers settled in, and the plane taxied toward the runway. Yet, as the engines roared to life and the aircraft lifted into the air, it became clear this story was far from over. What had begun as a simple act of kindness was about to take an unexpected turn. Once the flight reached cruising altitude and the engines settled into a low hum, flight attendants moved through the aisles offering drinks and snacks. But the cabin atmosphere remained anything but routine. Passengers continued to glance between Barron in the economy section and the veteran now seated in first class. Admiring whispers spread, yet the most remarkable part of the story was still to come. The veteran initially sat quietly, sipping water and staring out the window, his hands resting lightly on his lap, their faint tremor still visible. Then, as if the weight of the moment demanded it, he turned to the middle-aged woman seated beside him. "I have to say something," he began, his voice just loud enough to be heard. The woman looked at him, curiosity lighting her expression. The veteran adjusted the Purple Heart pinned to his lapel and sighed deeply before continuing. "That young man who gave me this seat, his family once saved my life." The woman blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" she asked. The veteran leaned back in his seat, his voice steadier now as he began to share his story. "It was during the Vietnam War. I was stationed overseas and far from home, with no family to turn to. I got badly injured, shot twice in the leg, and by the time I made it stateside, I was lost. No purpose, no direction, no family waiting for me. Nothing." His voice wavered momentarily, but he pressed on. "I ended up in New York, trying to rebuild my life. I didn't have a roof over my head, or even enough for a meal most days. One afternoon, I was outside a diner, clearly struggling, when a man stopped to talk to me. He didn't just hand me $1 and walk away. He listened to my story." The veteran's eyes glistened as he paused. That man was Donald Trump's father, Fred. The woman's eyes widened in astonishment, and nearby passengers, who had been subtly eavesdropping, leaned closer. "Fred Trump?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. The veteran nodded, his expression growing wistful. "Yes, he didn't owe me a thing, but he made sure I had a place to stay and a job to get back on my feet. He never asked for anything in return. All he said was, 'You served this country. It's the least we can do.'" I'll never forget those words. By now, several passengers in first class were openly listening, and the story began to spread through the cabin. The veteran's voice gained strength as he continued, his eyes shimmering with gratitude. "I always wanted to thank his family, but I never had the chance. Life moved on, and I thought the opportunity was gone forever. But now, today, that man's grandson has given me a gift I'll never forget. What are the odds of something like this happening?" In economy, Barron remained unaware of the growing buzz throughout the cabin. His focus stayed on his book, his tall frame awkwardly folded into the tight seat. Meanwhile, in first class, the veteran's revelation had sparked a ripple of amazement among the passengers. They exchanged glances, and a murmur of awe spread like wildfire. One of the flight attendants leaned toward the veteran and asked gently, "Would you like me to tell him what you just shared?" The veteran hesitated, then shook his head. "No, not yet. Let the boy have his piece. He doesn't need to know how much this means to me, at least not right now." Still, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What had begun as a quiet act of kindness now seemed imbued with a sense of destiny, as though the stars had aligned for this precise moment. And then something even more unexpected happened. The veteran sat in reflective silence, his story hanging in the air like a challenge left unspoken. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, some leaning in closer, whispering their thoughts. What had started as a routine flight had turned into something far more meaningful. It was the man seated directly across from the veteran who broke the silence. In his early 40s, his face was tired, yet approachable. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice steady but touched with emotion. "But your story really hit home. My grandfather served in Vietnam, too. He always talked about how much it meant when people back home cared enough to help. Hearing what Fred Trump did for you, that's rare. Too rare." The veteran nodded, a faint smile forming. "It's the little things, son. People don't realize how far a small act of kindness can go. Back then, I thought my life was over, but that man's generosity gave me a second chance." Across the aisle, a young mother holding a sleeping toddler spoke up. "You know, my dad used to say the same thing. He wasn't a veteran, but he always told me that when someone lifts you up, even just a little, you pass it on. It's like a chain reaction. What Barron did today, it's proof that kindness still matters." The veteran's expression softened as he listened. "It's true," he said. "And it's not just about big gestures. Sometimes just being seen, being acknowledged, it can change everything. That's what Fred Trump did for me, and it's what his grandson has done for me again today." As the passengers continued to share their own stories, each more heartfelt than the last, a flight attendant, visibly moved, perched on the armrest of an empty seat near the veteran. "I wasn't planning to say anything," she began, her voice tinged with emotion. "But my brother served in Iraq. He didn't talk much about it, but when he came home, he told me that the people who stopped to thank him, or helped him in little ways, those moments stuck with him. Sometimes they were the only thing keeping him going. The veteran nodded, his face a blend of empathy and quiet pride. Your brother's right. It's the little things that keep you grounded when everything else feels like it's falling apart. In economy, Barron noticed a few passengers glancing back at him. Though he didn't know the full extent of what was unfolding, their faces, filled with gratitude and awe, caught his attention. He gave a polite nod to a woman who smiled at him. What had started as a simple gesture had sparked a cascade of reflections and connections that no one on the flight could have anticipated. The veteran turned to the flight attendant and said, "You know, I've always believed that gratitude doesn't stop with the person who helps you. It grows. Fred Trump helped me rebuild my life, and I've spent every day since trying to honor that by helping others. Today, Barron reminded me of that mission. It's funny how life works, isn't it?" The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing a slight jolt. Yet the mood in the cabin remained steady, a newfound sense of unity and understanding prevailing among the passengers. The conversations on the plane felt like a collective release, as though every passenger was woven into an invisible tapestry of kindness, gratitude, and resilience. Just as the plane began its descent into Newark, the most unexpected moment of all unfolded. The cabin grew quieter as the final approach was announced. In first class, the veteran sat silently, his hands clasped, as he gazed out the window, lost in thought. Elsewhere, passengers exchanged quiet, knowing glances, the events of the flight still resonating deeply. In the economy section, the flight attendant, who had spoken with the veteran, approached Barron. She knelt slightly to meet his gaze and spoke softly. "I thought you'd want to know. There's something remarkable the gentleman you gave your seat to shared about your family. Would you like to hear it?" Barron looked up from his book. His interest piqued. Slowly he closed the cover, the title hidden from view. "Sure," he replied simply, his voice calm yet curious. The attendant hesitated briefly, as if choosing her words carefully. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him when he was at his lowest. He gave him a place to live and a job, expecting nothing in return. Today, you reminded him of that kindness through your own gesture." For a moment, Barron was silent, his expression composed, yet contemplative. His eyes softened, as if the weight of the story was beginning to settle on him. Finally, he spoke. "That's something, isn't it?" The flight attendant smiled warmly. "It is. I thought you should know." As the plane touched down, the veteran rose from his seat, preparing to disembark. To everyone's surprise, he walked back toward the economy section. His eyes scanned the rows until they found Barron, who was now standing to retrieve his bag. Their gazes met, and the veteran extended his hand. "Young man," he said, his voice firm yet filled with gratitude, "I wanted to thank you face to face. What you did today, it brought my life full circle. Your family has a legacy of kindness, and today you carried it forward. Never forget how much moments like this matter." Barron shook the veteran's hand firmly, his voice steady but modest. "I didn't do anything special, sir. You deserved it." The cabin fell silent, the passengers riveted by the exchange. Some had tears glistening in their eyes, while others wore soft, reflective smiles. The connection between the two, a young man and a seasoned veteran, felt like a living testament to the enduring power of empathy and gratitude. As the passengers filed off the plane, many paused to thank Barron for his gesture, while others approached the veteran to offer handshakes and words of appreciation for his service. The atmosphere was unlike anything anyone had experienced during a flight. At the gate, the veteran turned one last time, tipping his hat toward Barron. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't ever lose it." Barron nodded, his typically reserved demeanor softening, revealing the impact of the veteran's words. As he made his way toward baggage claim, he pulled out his phone, typing a brief message. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed send. The text read, "Grandpa would have been proud of today." This story serves as a powerful reminder of how one small act of kindness can create ripples far beyond the moment, connecting people in ways we can't always foresee. Kindness, gratitude, and empathy. These are the values that transcend time and place, forging bonds that endure. If this story inspired you, consider sharing it. Let's keep the conversation alive and remind the world that kindness still matters. And if you'd like more stories like this, join us next time for another unforgettable journey.